The smell was impossible to ignore. People living inside the Oxford apartments in Milwaukee would later describe it in different ways, but none of the descriptions fully captured how disturbing it really was. Some said it smelled like rotten meat left under the sun for days. Others compared it to sewage mixed with chemicals. A few residents claimed the odor was so thick it seemed to stick to the walls of the hallway itself. During summer nights when the heat trapped everything inside the building, the smell became unbearable. Tenants stuffed towels beneath their doors. Some sprayed air fresheners constantly. Others simply walked faster whenever they passed apartment 213. And every single time someone questioned Jeffrey Dahmer about it, he already had an explanation waiting. His freezer had broken. Some pork chops had spoiled. Tropical fish had died. Plumbing issues. Always something simple. Always something believable enough to end the conversation before it went any further. What nobody realized was that the smell drifting through the hallway wasn't coming from spoiled food. It was coming from human bodies, decomposing inside his apartment while ordinary life continued around him as if nothing was wrong. That's what makes the story feel almost unreal even decades later. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't live hidden away in the woods. He didn't isolate himself in some abandoned cabin far from civilization. He lived in a crowded apartment building surrounded by neighbors. Noise, conversations, televisions, footsteps, arguments, and everyday routines. People slept only a few feet away from him every night. They walked past his door carrying groceries. They heard him moving around inside. Some even spoke to him casually in the hallway. And all that time, something horrific was quietly growing behind that apartment door while the smell leaked out into the building like a warning nobody fully understood.
At first glance, Dahmer didn't look dangerous. That detail would haunt investigators later because it shattered the comforting idea that monsters should appear monstrous. He looked ordinary in the most forgettable way possible. Blonde hair, wire-frame glasses, calm voice, quiet posture. He blended into the background so naturally that many people barely remembered him at all until after his arrest. Neighbors described him as polite, shy, reserved. Some even said he seemed lonely more than threatening. That normal appearance became one of his greatest weapons because it lowered people's instincts. Human beings are trained to notice visible danger. Dahmer understood something terrifying. If you look harmless enough, people explain away the warning signs themselves. But beneath that quiet exterior was a mind that had been drifting toward darkness for years. Long before apartment 213 became infamous, there were signs that something inside Jeffrey Dahmer was deeply broken. As a child, he became fascinated with dead animals. Not casually curious in the way children sometimes are, but obsessively interested in what existed beneath skin and bone. He collected roadkill. He dissected animals. He stored remains. Death didn't repel him, it pulled him closer. Over time, that fascination evolved into something colder and more disturbing. By his teenage years, isolation had consumed most of his life. Alcohol became constant. Some classmates later remembered him showing up drunk during school hours. He struggled to connect with people emotionally. And underneath that loneliness, dangerous fantasies began forming. At first, those fantasies centered around control and possession more than murder itself. He became obsessed with the idea of keeping someone with him permanently, someone who could never leave, reject, or abandon him. That obsession would eventually twist into one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in American history. Inside the Oxford apartments, residents slowly became accustomed to strange things happening around Dahmer's apartment. The smell was the most obvious problem, but it wasn't the only one. There were odd noises late at night, strange sounds from inside the walls, heavy objects being moved around. At times, tenants noticed Dahmer carrying large bags through the hallway. Some remembered seeing him nervously avoid eye contact on certain days, while on others, he appeared strangely relaxed, almost cheerful. But the human mind has a powerful tendency to normalize discomfort when answers appear available. Every time the smell returned, Dahmer calmly explained it away again. And because the explanation sounded easier than the truth, people accepted it. But inside apartment 213, the reality had already become nightmarish. Human remains filled the rooms. Bodies were dismembered in the bathtub. Heads were stored inside refrigerators and freezers. Chemicals sat beside decomposing organs. Photographs documented victims before and after death. A blue industrial barrel filled with acid stood in the apartment, while flesh dissolved slowly inside it. The smell drifting through the building was death itself, leaking quietly into the hallway while Dahmer continued living among his neighbors, almost invisibly. By the summer of 1991, the odor had become impossible to fully ignore anymore. Complaints increased. Some residents later admitted they felt genuine fear whenever they passed his apartment because the smell no longer resembled normal garbage or spoiled food. It smelled biological, wrong. One tenant would later describe the hallway outside Dahmer's apartment as feeling infected, as if something heavy sat in the air itself. But even then, nobody imagined the scale of what was happening behind the door. Nobody imagined that multiple victims had already died inside that apartment, while the building continued functioning around him like nothing had changed. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer encountered a man named Tracy Edwards. Dahmer approached him casually, the same way he approached many of his victims. Calm voice, friendly demeanor. He offered money in exchange for photographs and drinks back at his apartment. Strange, yes, but not immediately terrifying. Dahmer didn't overpower people violently in public because his methods depended on making them feel safe enough to willingly walk into danger. That was part of what made him so terrifying. He weaponized normality. When Tracy Edwards entered apartment 213, he immediately noticed something unsettling about the environment. The smell hit first, stronger than expected, thick and sour beneath the chemical odor lingering in the apartment. Then came the smaller details. A blue barrel in the corner of the room. Strange behavior from Dahmer, a knife near the bed. The atmosphere felt wrong in a way Edwards couldn't fully explain yet. And then he noticed the movie playing on the television. The Exorcist 3. Dahmer seemed emotionally absorbed by it, almost hypnotized. There was something vacant in his expression that deeply unsettled Edwards, like he was watching someone drift between reality and fantasy in real time. As the night continued, Dahmer's behavior became increasingly unstable. One moment he spoke softly, the next he seemed tense and unpredictable. Then suddenly, everything changed. Dahmer handcuffed Tracy Edwards and pressed a knife against him. At one point, he told Edwards he intended to eat his heart. The words sounded so bizarre and horrifying that for a moment they barely felt real. But Edwards quickly understood something critical. This man was serious. For hours, he carefully tried to stay calm. He spoke gently, avoided sudden movements, tried to keep Dahmer emotionally stable enough to survive. Meanwhile, surrounding them inside the apartment were the hidden remains of previous victims. Human heads sat nearby. Decomposing body parts remained inside containers. Polaroid photographs documented unspeakable acts only feet away from where Edwards sat, pretending not to panic. Every second inside the apartment became psychological survival. Eventually, Edwards noticed a brief opening in Dahmer's attention. A tiny moment where instinct overpowered fear. He punched Dahmer and ran from the apartment barefoot and handcuffed, sprinting through the streets until police officers encountered him. He was terrified, sweating, frantic. One handcuff still dangled from his wrist as he explained what had happened. At first, officers appeared uncertain. Dahmer still looked ordinary, calm, polite, controlled. When confronted, he behaved almost casually, laughing nervously and minimizing the situation as some kind of misunderstanding between adults. And for a brief moment, it nearly worked again. That's one of the most disturbing patterns throughout the entire case. Dahmer repeatedly survived suspicion because his appearance and demeanor softened people's instincts. Evil rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it speaks softly, smiles politely, and offers simple explanations until everyone lowers their guard. The officers escorted Dahmer back to apartment 213 so he could retrieve the handcuff key. The moment they entered the apartment, the smell hit them immediately, stronger than expected, thick with decomposition. One officer later described the atmosphere as feeling physically wrong, as if the apartment itself carried some invisible weight pressing against the body. Dahmer once again attempted to explain the odor away calmly, but this time something shifted. One officer noticed a partially open drawer near the bed. Inside were Polaroid photographs. At first glance, the images looked confusing, then horrifying. The photographs showed dismembered human bodies posed in different stages of mutilation. These were not fantasies or drawings. They were real crime scene images created by Dahmer himself. The officer froze. For a brief second, his brain struggled to fully process what he was seeing. Then instinct took over. He looked directly at Dahmer and realized the nightmare standing in front of him was real. Chaos erupted instantly. Police restrained Dahmer while officers began searching the apartment more thoroughly. What they discovered inside would permanently scar experienced investigators who believed they had already seen the worst humanity could offer. The refrigerator contained a severed human head. Additional skulls were discovered throughout the apartment. Human organs sat inside containers. Body parts wrapped in plastic bags filled rooms. Chemical supplies lined shelves beside tools used for dismemberment. The blue barrel contained dissolving human remains suspended in acid. The smell was so overwhelming that several officers reportedly had to step outside to avoid vomiting. Others simply stood speechless, unable to mentally process the scale of horror surrounding them. What terrified investigators most wasn't only the violence itself, it was the organization. Apartment 213 did not feel chaotic in the way most murder scenes do. It felt methodical, systematic, controlled. Dahmer had turned murder into routine. The apartment functioned like a private world disconnected from ordinary morality, where death became part of everyday life, hidden behind bland walls and quiet conversations with neighbors. Once arrested, Dahmer did something investigators didn't expect. He confessed almost immediately. There was no dramatic denial, no elaborate attempt to shift blame. Instead, he spoke with eerie calmness about the murders. Detectives later described him as emotionally detached, while explaining details that were almost impossible to hear. Over hours and days of interrogation, Dahmer described how he lured victims home, drugged them, killed them, photographed them, dismembered them, and preserved parts of their bodies afterward. The deeper investigators explored his psychology, the darker everything became. At the center of Dahmer's confessions was his obsessive fear of abandonment. He admitted he didn't want people to leave him. That desire eventually transformed into the horrifying need for complete control over another human being. At one point, he even attempted crude experiments designed to create submissive zombies by drilling into victims' skulls and injecting chemicals into their brains while they were still alive. The level of emotional emptiness behind those acts disturbed even veteran detectives. But alongside all the horror, one detail kept returning again and again throughout the investigation: the smell. because the smell symbolized the entire tragedy of the case. It had existed openly for months. It drifted through hallways, it entered neighboring apartments. People noticed it constantly, yet nobody fully understood what it truly meant until police opened Dahmer's refrigerator and discovered human remains inside. After the arrest, the public began asking a painful question. How was Jeffrey Dahmer not stopped sooner? And the deeper investigators looked, the more disturbing the answers became. There had been complaints, prior arrests, witness reports, suspicious behavior. At one point, a 14-year-old boy escaped from Dahmer, injured and drugged. Witnesses called police immediately, but when officers arrived, Dahmer calmly convinced them the child was simply his intoxicated adult boyfriend. The officers accepted the explanation and escorted the boy directly back into Dahmer's apartment, despite protests from bystanders. Hours later, the child was murdered. That moment became one of the most haunting failures in the entire case, because it revealed something deeply uncomfortable about human psychology. Sometimes evil survives not because it's invisible, but because people instinctively search for less disturbing explanations first. Dahmer understood that instinct better than almost anyone. He relied on normality, calmness, simplicity, the ability to appear harmless long enough for suspicion to fade. And all the while, the smell continued spreading through the building. Years later, former residents of the Oxford apartments still described the odor with visible discomfort, not only because it was horrifying in hindsight, but because they realized they had physically lived beside death itself without fully understanding it. Families cooked dinner while bodies decomposed down the hallway. People watched television while human remains dissolved in acid only feet away. Neighbors passed Jeffrey Dahmer casually in the hallway, while unimaginable acts waited behind his apartment door. That contrast makes the story feel uniquely disturbing even among true crime cases. It wasn't hidden deep underground. It existed inside ordinary life. The horror blended seamlessly into routine until routine itself became terrifying. Eventually, apartment 213 was emptied. Investigators removed the evidence. The building was demolished years later. The smell disappeared from the hallways. But psychologically, it never really left, because once people learned what caused it, every memory changed permanently. Every excuse sounded darker. Every ignored warning became heavier. Every ordinary interaction with Dahmer transformed into something deeply unsettling in retrospect. And maybe that's the reason this story still disturbs people so intensely decades later. The smell inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment represented something larger than the crimes themselves. It represented the terrifying idea that evil can exist quietly beside ordinary life for long periods of time while people explain away the warning signs one by one. Not because they are stupid, not because they don't care, but because the truth is sometimes too horrifying for the human mind to accept immediately. In the end, the smell was never really hidden. It drifted beneath the apartment door for months like a silent warning.